still see Berlin in ruins whenever I close my eyes. No matter how many years have passed, the memory is not blurred or softened. It is sharp, like broken glass, cutting into me whenever I let my mind wander. I was only 23 in the spring of 1945, a soldier worn thin by years of war. My uniform was no longer a source of pride. It was a tattered, second skin, heavy with dust, sweat, and dried blood. I was alive, yes, but I often wondered for what purpose. Then, the city was no longer a place of life. It had become a tomb. Buildings leaned against each other like trunks, their faces blackened by fire, their insides gutted. Smoke clung to the streets the way fog does in the countryside, only this smoke stung the eyes and filled the lungs with poison. Each morning, the sky glowed an unnatural orange, lit not by dawn, but by the burning districts where shells had fallen through the night. We had been told to hold the line, to fight to the last man. But the truth was written in the eyes of every soldier I passed. There was no fight left in us, only fear, exhaustion, and a desperate will to see another sunrise. I would hear the speeches on the radio, the hollow promises of victory, but they echoed in my head like jokes told at a funeral. We knew the Soviets were at the gates. We knew the end had already come. At night, I hid in a cellar with 2 other soldiers, boys really, neither older than 19. One of them, named Otto, clutched a cigarette between his trembling fingers, though he barely smoked. The other, Karl, whispered prayers to a God he had not spoken to in years. I sat between them, my rifle across my knees, and listened to the distant thunder of artillery. Each blast shook the ground beneath us, sending bits of plaster raining from the ceiling. Sometimes I thought the building above would collapse and bury us alive. A part of me almost wished it would. During the day, I would climb out and see the civilians scattered in the ruins. Mothers wrapped their children in blankets too thin for the cold. Old men carried buckets of water from shattered pipes. The look in their eyes was the same as mine, hollow, tired, and stripped of hope. They avoided us, the soldiers, as if we were already ghosts, and maybe we were. On one of those days, I passed a woman sitting against a crumbled wall, her hands clutching a baby pressed to her chest. The child did not cry. Small face was pale, lips blue. I did not know if it was asleep or if life had already left it. The woman rocked back and forth, humming a tune, her eyes staring at something beyond this world. I wanted to say something, to offer a word of comfort, but my mouth stayed shut. What comfort was left to give in Berlin? That night, the Soviet shells came closer. The ground shook as though the earth itself was breaking apart. Flames licked the sky, and the air filled with dust so thick I could hardly breathe. We rushed into the streets, stumbling over rubble, searching for any cover. I remember falling against a wall, my ears ringing, my body numb. When the sound faded, all that remained was the crying of a child echoing through the ruins. That sound haunts me still. We set up a barricade near Friedrichstraße, though we had little more than rifles and the courage scraped from fear. I stood with Otto and Karl behind a mound of broken bricks, staring into the smoke-filled street. The boy, Karl, whispered, "Do you think God sees us here?" I didn't answer. My faith had died long before Berlin began to burn. The Soviets advanced with a force I cannot describe. Their tanks growled through the streets, crushing debris beneath their treads. The sound was like metal thunder, steady and unstoppable. Shadows moved through the smoke soldiers, hundreds of them. Shots cracked, men screamed, and the world dissolved into chaos. I fired until my rifle jammed, then scrambled to clear it with shaking hands. Otto shouted beside me, his voice thin against the roar of battle. Then, suddenly, he was silent. I turned, and he was gnawingly, his helmet remained, lying in the dirt where his head had been moments before. Fear consumed me then. My legs felt weak. My breath came in gasps. Round me, men fell, some screaming, some silent, all swallowed by the storm. I pressed myself into the rubble, covering my head as if the stones might shield me from death. When the firing eased, when the tanks moved further down the street, I crawled into the ruins of a building. My hands bled from the sharp edges of brick and glass. I hid in the shadows, listening to the groans of the wounded and the boots of the Soviets marching past. They shouted to each other in voices I could not understand, but their tone was enough harsh, commanding, merciless. That night, I lay in the darkness, my body trembling uncontrollably. But I no longer felt human. I felt like a rat hiding in a collapsing maze, waiting for the walls to crush me. And in that moment, as I listened to the city burn, I wondered if surviving was truly better than death. I woke the next morning to silence. It was the kind of silence that feels unnatural, heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. My body ached, every muscle stiff from sleeping against cold stone. My uniform was damp with sweat and dust, and when I touched my face, I found dried blood along my cheek. I didn't even know whose blood it was. I crawled out from the ruins and into a street that no longer looked like a street. Buildings had been flattened into heaps of brick. Tram lines hung twisted like broken ribs across the ground. Smoke curled up from fires that refused to die, and the air carried the smell of charred wood mixed with something far worse, the unmistakable odor of burned flesh. In the distance, I heard sobbing. I followed the sound cautiously, rifle still clutched in my hands, though I had little ammunition left. Around the corner, I found a cellar door half open. Inside, a family huddled together. An old woman, her face lined like cracked porcelain, cradled a little boy in her arms. He stared at me with wide eyes, not in fear, but in something deeper, as if he was too tired even to be afraid anymore. Go. The old woman whispered. Her voice was hoarse. Leave us be. I stood frozen. I wanted to say I wasn't there to harm them, but my words stuck in my throat. What difference would they have made? I was still a soldier in uniform, still a reminder of the war that had brought hell into their home. So I lowered my eyes and backed away. That was Berlin then, fragments of people hidden in the shadows, clinging to what little they had left. Some prayed, some cursed, most just waited. Waiting for the Soviets to break through completely. Waiting for the end. By midday, the artillery began again. The Soviets pounded the city without mercy, the ground shaking as if giants were hammering on the gates of hell. I ran with a group of stragglers, men I didn't even know, down into the subway tunnels. The air down there was damp, heavy, with the smell of oil and sweat. Hundreds of civilians were packed along the platforms, their belongings spread out in ragged bundles. Babies cried, dogs barked, and the low murmur of voices filled the stale air. I found a spot against the wall and sank down, my rifle leaning against my shoulder. Across from me, a young woman clutched a notebook tightly to her chest. Key, looked no older than 20. Huh. When she noticed me watching, she said softly, "It's my diary. If I don't survive this, at least someone will know we were here." Her words struck me harder than any shell. "Ta." I nodded, but couldn't bring myself to reply. I thought of the scraps of paper I had carried in my own pack once. Letters I had written to my mother during the early years of the war. Letters I never sent. They were lost now, burned or buried in some trench far from here. That night in the tunnels, the lights flickered and went out. People lit candles, their small flames trembling against the damp air. It felt like a scene from another world, shadows dancing against concrete walls, while above us, the city tore itself apart. A little girl asked her father when they could go home. He pulled her close and whispered, "Soon," but his eyes told the truth. There was no home left to return to. When dawn came, I climbed back to the surface. The city was louder than ever. Gunfire echoing between the ruins. Soviet voices shouting commands. I saw a man hanging from a lamppost, a crude sign tied to his chest, branding him a traitor. His body swung gently in the breeze, a grotesque reminder that Berlin devoured its own, even as the enemy closed in. I moved carefully through the rubble, every step a gamble. Twice, I thought I saw movement, shadows slipping between broken walls, but when I raised my rifle, there was nothing. My nerves were stretched so thin that even the flutter of pigeons made me flinch. Later, I stumbled upon Carl, the boy who had prayed in the cellar. He was crouched beside a collapsed wall, his face pale, his uniform stained dark with blood, his hand pressed against his stomach where a wound festered. "They're everywhere," he whispered when he saw me. His voice was weak. "We can't hold them back. It's over." I knelt beside him, unsure of what to do. I had no bandages, no medicine. All I could offer was my presence. His eyes darted around, wide with panic. "Do you think God will forgive us?" he asked. I wanted to tell him yes, but the words felt like lies. Instead, I took his hand and held it until the light in his eyes faded. When he was gone, I closed his eyes and sat there in silence, the world around me reduced to the sound of distant gunfire. By evening, I found myself near the Reichstag. It's a grand building that had once symbolized power and pride was now a shattered husk, its columns scarred, its dome torn apart. Soviet shells struck it relentlessly, each explosion sending clouds of dust and stone into the air. Soldiers ran in every direction, some firing, some screaming, some dropping their weapons and fleeing. I crouched behind a pile of rubble, watching as a red flag was carried closer. My hands shook, not from the cold, but from the weight of knowing what this meant. The heart of Berlin was collapsing. The empire that had promised 1,000 years was dying in less than 20. That night, I could not sleep. I sat in the ruins of a stairwell, my back against the wall, listening to the city's death throes. Fires burned endlessly, painting the sky in shades of orange and black. The cries of the wounded rose and fell like waves, mingling with a low, steady advance of Soviet artillery. I pressed my head into my hands and wept quietly, the sound lost in the chaos. For the first time, I allowed myself to think beyond survival. I thought of home, of the quiet fields where I had grown up. I thought of my mother's voice, the warmth of her hands when she scolded me as a child. I thought of the friends I had once laughed with, now buried in places I could no longer find. And I realized with a crushing weight that even if I survived Berlin, I would never truly go home again. Berlin had taken too much. It had taken lives. It had taken faith. And now it was taking whatever fragments of humanity remained in me. The morning came not with light, but with fire. Shells rained down without pause, each blast shaking the ground as though the earth itself wanted to swallow us. I had crawled into what was left of an office building, hiding in a half-collapsed room with no roof. My ears rang constantly, the world muffled by the endless thunder of artillery. Dust fell in clouds with every impact. I clutched my rifle, but knew deep down it was nothing more than a piece of wood and metal in my hands. The Soviets were everywhere now. I heard them before I saw them. Boots striking against broken stone. Voices barking in Russian. The sound of victory carried in their tone. I pressed myself against the wall, heart pounding, trying to make myself disappear into the rubble. Through a crack, I saw them. Red Army soldiers moved with purpose, their uniforms caked in mud, their rifles gleaming even in the smoke-filled air. Some were grim, focused. Others shouted in bursts of triumph. Berlin, the fortress city, was theirs. One of them stopped suddenly, just meters away from where I hid. He raised his weapon, scanning the ruins with sharp eyes. My breath caught in my throat. I thought, this is it. This is where it ends. But then another called out to him, and they moved on. My hands shook uncontrollably. I'd escaped death by seconds. But how many more times could luck save me? Later, as I tried to move deeper into the city, I stumbled across a group of civilians. They were being herded out of a building by Soviet soldiers. Women clutched children. Men kept their eyes to the ground. One young boy, maybe 12 years old, turned his head and looked directly at me. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, yet in them I saw recognition. He knew I was no different from him now, a trapped animal waiting for whatever fate would bring. I kept moving, each step heavier than the last. Hunger gnawed at me. I hadn't eaten in 2 days. Water was scarce. My body felt weak, but fear pushed me forward. Fear and something else, a strange, stubborn thread of survival that refused to snap. I reached the Tiergarten. What was once a proud park had become a wasteland of churned earth and broken trees. Hanks lay scattered like giant carcasses, their steel holes ripped open, smoke still rising from them. The ground was littered with helmets, rifles, and the bodies of men who had fallen where they stood. Crows circled overhead, their cries sharp and cruel against the sky. I collapsed beside a shattered statue, too tired to go further. My body ached, my throat burned. I thought of letting go, of closing my eyes and never opening them again. But then, in the distance, I saw it. The Reichstag, what was left of it. Flames licked at its walls, the roof caved in, yet still it stood, defiant against the storm. And on its highest point, fluttering in the smoke, I saw the red flag. The sight crushed me. It was over. Truly over. The war that had consumed every breath, every moment of my life for years, had come to its bitter end. There was no victory here, only ashes. That night, I was taken. Soviet soldiers found me near the ruins of a barricade. I didn't resist. I dropped my rifle and raised my hands, my voice too hoarse to speak. They searched me roughly, their eyes filled with suspicion and exhaustion. One of them shoved me toward a group of prisoners already gathered. We were marched through the city, a broken line of ghosts stumbling through the ruins of what had once been our capital. Civilians lined the streets, watching us with a mixture of contempt and pity. Some spat, others turned their faces away. I could not blame them. We had brought this upon ourselves. As we passed, I saw the young woman with the diary again. She stood in a doorway, her notebook still clutched in her hands. Our eyes met briefly. She gave me the faintest nod, as if to say, "Remember this? Tell it if you live." Then she disappeared back into the shadows. In the days that followed, I was held in a makeshift camp on the outskirts of the city. We were given little food, barely enough water, and no answers. The Soviets guarded us with cold eyes. At night, I lay on the hard ground, staring at the sky through barbed wire. The city burned endlessly in the distance, the smoke rising like a funeral pyre. I thought of everything I had seen: Carl dying with a prayer on his lips, the family hiding in the cellar, the man hanging from the lamppost, the child in the crowd. Faces and voices swirled in my mind, haunting me. I wondered if I would carry them forever, if they would visit me in my sleep until the day I died. And then it struck me, maybe that was my punishment, to survive when so many hadn't, to carry the weight of their stories when they could not. Eventually, the war ended, officially at least, but for me, it never truly did. I was released months later, a shell of who I once was. When I walked through the countryside back toward what was left of home, the fields were quiet, the villages scarred. Life was trying to begin again, but I felt like a stranger in it. Years have passed since then. My hair has gone gray. My hands tremble when I write, yet the memories remain as sharp as broken glass. I can still smell the smoke of Berlin, still hear the cries echoing in the tunnels, still see the flag rising over the Reichstag. Sometimes people ask me what it was like to be there, expect stories of battles, of glory, of bravery. I tell them none of that. I tell them the truth, that war is not about flags or victories. It is about loss, about faces you never forget, about a city that became a grave for millions. I was there when Berlin fell. I walked through its ruins. I saw its people broken. I felt its last breath. And, though I lived, I left a part of myself in those ashes. I carry Berlin with me still, and it changed me forever.